He's just a driver. The dismissive words echoed through the Memphis General Hospital emergency room as Dr. Richard Morrison waved his hand toward Pete O'Sullivan, the 52-year-old ambulance driver who had just delivered another critical patient safely to the trauma bay. Pete had been driving ambulances for 30 years, racing through Memphis streets at all hours, navigating traffic with precision that had saved countless lives. But to Dr. Morrison, he was nothing more than a glorified taxi driver. What Dr. Morrison didn't know was that Pete O'Sullivan had a perfect record, never lost a patient during transport, never been late to a critical call, never failed to get someone to the hospital alive who had a fighting chance. Elvis Presley, who had been visiting his mother's friend recovering from heart surgery, overheard the doctor's casual dismissal and watched as Pete simply nodded, collected his equipment, and headed back to his ambulance without a word of protest. Something about the quiet dignity of this man who absorbed insults while dedicating his life to saving others struck Elvis as profoundly wrong. Pete's secret was about to transform not just his own recognition, but Elvis's understanding of what true heroism looked like when nobody was watching. It was March 18, 1973, in Memphis, Tennessee. The unseasonably warm spring air carried the scent of blooming dogwood trees through the open emergency room doors, where Pete O'Sullivan was finishing the paperwork for his latest transport. The patient, a construction worker who had suffered a heart attack on a job site, was now stable and being prepared for surgery, thanks in large part to Pete's skill in keeping him calm and alive during the race to the hospital. Pete had been working this same route for 3 decades, ever since he'd returned from Korea in 1943. The war had changed him in ways he rarely talked about, but it had also given him something valuable: the ability to stay calm under pressure, to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death, and to find meaning in service to others rather than personal recognition. His ambulance was a modified Cadillac, equipped with the basic life support equipment available in the early 1970s. It wasn't much by modern standards, but in Pete's hands, it had become a mobile emergency room where miracles happened on a regular basis. He knew every street, every alley, every shortcut in Memphis better than most taxi drivers. He could navigate to any hospital in the city blindfolded, and often had to rely on that knowledge when emergency calls came in during heavy fog or severe storms. What made Pete exceptional wasn't just his driving ability, though. Over the years, he had taught himself basic medical procedures by observing doctors and nurses, asking questions during quiet moments, and studying medical textbooks during his off hours. He could take vital signs, administer basic first aid, and even perform CPR when necessary. More importantly, he had developed an intuitive understanding of how to comfort frightened patients and worried families during some of the worst moments of their lives. Dr. Richard Morrison, who had made the dismissive comment about Pete being just a driver, was new to Memphis General. He had recently arrived from a prestigious hospital in Boston, bringing with him an attitude about medical hierarchy that placed ambulance drivers barely above janitors in terms of importance to patient care. In his view, real medical professionals were doctors, nurses, and technicians. Everyone else was support staff, whose contributions were negligible. Morrison had no idea that Pete O'Sullivan was legendary among the nurses and emergency room staff who had worked with him over the years. They knew that when Pete called ahead with a patient assessment, his evaluation was usually more accurate than those of less experienced paramedics. They trusted his judgment about which patients needed immediate attention and which ones could wait. They had watched him perform minor miracles of timing and skill that had saved lives when seconds mattered. Elvis had been at the hospital for over an hour, sitting with Mrs. Catherine Williams, who had been like a second mother to him growing up in the Lauderdale Courts housing project. Mrs. Williams was recovering from heart valve surgery, and Elvis visited her every day during her stay, bringing flowers, books, and most importantly, his presence during a frightening time in her life. It was during one of these visits that Elvis first noticed Pete O'Sullivan. The ambulance driver had brought in an elderly man who had collapsed at a downtown bus stop. Elvis watched from the hallway as Pete carefully transferred the patient from his ambulance stretcher to the hospital gurney, all while providing a clear, detailed report to the emergency room nurse about the man's condition, vital signs, and the treatment he had administered during transport. What impressed Elvis wasn't just Pete's competence but his genuine care for his patient. Even after the medical staff took over, Pete lingered for a few minutes to make sure the man was settled and comfortable. He spoke quietly to the patient, reassuring him that he was in good hands and that his family had been notified. It was the behavior of someone who saw each patient not as a case or a job, but as a person whose well-being mattered deeply to him. Over the next few days, Elvis began paying more attention to Pete's interactions with patients, families, and hospital staff. He noticed that veteran nurses always made time to chat with Pete when he came in with patients. He observed that experienced doctors listened carefully when Pete provided patient assessments. He watched families thank Pete with genuine warmth, sometimes hugging him as if he were a family member who had helped them through a crisis. But he also noticed that hospital administrators and newer medical staff often treated Pete as if he were invisible. They would talk over him during patient handoffs, dismiss his observations about patient conditions, and generally act as if his 3 decades of experience meant nothing compared to their medical degrees. The incident with Dr. Morrison was particularly galling because it happened in front of several medical students who were touring the emergency room. Morrison had been explaining the hierarchy of medical care, emphasizing the importance of doctors and nurses while describing support staff as necessary but not medically significant. When Pete arrived with a patient, Morrison used him as an example of what he meant. "This gentleman, for instance, is just a driver," Morrison had said, gesturing dismissively toward Pete. "He provides transportation, nothing more. The real medical work begins when patients reach qualified professionals like ourselves." Pete had heard worse over the years, but something about being used as a teaching example of insignificance stung more than usual. He had been having a particularly difficult week, with several tragic cases where patients died despite his best efforts to get them to the hospital in time. The constant stress of racing against death, combined with the emotional toll of comforting families during their worst moments, had left him feeling drained and unappreciated. Elvis, who had been walking past the emergency room on his way to Mrs. Williams' room, stopped when he heard Dr. Morrison's comment. He watched Pete's face carefully and saw the brief flash of hurt before the older man composed himself and went back to work. Something about that moment of quiet dignity, in the face of casual cruelty, reminded Elvis of his own experiences with people who had dismissed his talents before they understood what he was capable of achieving. That evening, as Pete was finishing his shift, Elvis approached him in the hospital parking lot. Pete was loading equipment into his ambulance, preparing for the drive home after another 14-hour day of emergency calls. "Excuse me," Elvis said. "You're Pete O'Sullivan, aren't you?" Pete looked up, surprised to be approached by someone he recognized as Elvis Presley. "Yes, sir. Can I help you with something?" "I've been watching you work this week," Elvis said. "I wanted to tell you how impressed I am with what you—" Pete looked puzzled. "I'm just an ambulance driver, Mr. Presley. Nothing special about that." "That's where you're wrong," Elvis replied. "I've seen you with patients, with families, with the medical staff. You're not just driving, you're saving lives. And I think it's time someone recognized that." Over the next hour, sitting in the hospital parking lot as the spring evening grew cool, Pete told Elvis stories he had never shared with anyone. He talked about the night he had delivered 3 babies in the back of his ambulance during a severe thunderstorm when the roads were too flooded to reach the hospital. He described the time he had kept a suicide victim alive by talking to her during the entire 20-minute drive to the emergency room, convincing her that her life had value and that her family needed her. He told Elvis about the teenager who had been critically injured in a motorcycle accident and who had survived because Pete knew a back road shortcut that cut 5 minutes off the usual route to the trauma center. He shared the story of an elderly woman who had suffered a stroke at home alone and who had made a full recovery because Pete had recognized the symptoms and administered the correct initial treatment during transport. With each story, Elvis's respect for Pete grew. These weren't just tales of good driving or lucky timing, they were accounts of skill, knowledge, and courage under pressure that rivaled anything Elvis had seen from celebrated medical professionals. Pete had been performing heroic acts of service for 3 decades, but because he didn't have a medical degree or work in a hospital, his contributions had been largely ignored by the people who determined how recognition was distributed in the medical field. "Pete," Elvis said finally, "how many lives do you think you've saved over 30 years? Pete was quiet for a long moment, thinking. "I've kept records," he said eventually. "Not officially, just for my own. Well, I'm not sure why I keep them, but I write down every call, every patient, every outcome when I can find out what happened to them. Can you show me those records?" Pete hesitated, then walked to his ambulance and opened a metal cabinet that contained his personal belongings. He pulled out a series of notebooks, worn from handling, and filled with Pete's careful handwriting. Each entry included the date, time, location, patient condition, treatment provided during transport, and when possible, the final outcome. Elvis opened one of the notebooks and began reading. The entries were clinical, but compassionate, professional, but personal. Pete had recorded not just medical details, but human ones. The names of family members who had ridden in the ambulance, words of comfort he had offered to frightened patients, small acts of kindness he had performed during difficult moments. As Elvis read, he began to understand the scope of Pete's impact. The notebooks documented thousands of emergency calls, hundreds of critical transports, and dozens of situations where Pete's skill had made the difference between life and death. More importantly, they revealed a man who had dedicated his life to service without expectation of reward, who had found meaning in helping others during their worst moments. "Pete," Elvis said, looking up from the notebooks, "these records show that you've saved over 3,000 lives. Do you realize what that means?" Pete shrugged uncomfortably. "It's just my job, Mr. Presley. Anyone could do it." "That's not true, and I think you know it. What you do requires skill, courage, and compassion that most people don't have, and it's time the world knew about it." Elvis's plan began forming immediately. He had connections throughout Memphis and beyond immediate contacts, civic organizations, medical societies, and influential individuals who could help bring recognition to Pete's 30 years of selfless service. But more than that, he wanted to change how society viewed the essential workers who made heroic contributions without receiving credit for their efforts. The next morning, Elvis began making phone calls. He contacted the Memphis Commercial Appeal newspaper, suggesting they do a story about unsung heroes in the medical field. He reached out to the Tennessee Hospital Association, proposing that they create an award for non-physician medical workers who had made exceptional contributions to patient care. He spoke with the Memphis City Council about officially recognizing Pete's service to the community. But Elvis's most important call was to Dr. Morrison himself. Using his influence and celebrity status, Elvis arranged a meeting with the hospital administrator, who had dismissed Pete so casually. "Dr. Morrison," Elvis said, when they met in the hospital administrator's office, "I think you need to learn more about Pete O'Sullivan before you use him as an example of unimportant support staff." Elvis had brought several of Pete's notebooks with him, along with documentation of his perfect safety record and letters from families whose lives Pete had touched. He presented this evidence methodically, showing Dr. Morrison that the man he had dismissed as just a driver was actually one of the most skilled and dedicated medical professionals in the hospital's network. Dr. Morrison's initial defensiveness gradually gave way to genuine surprise, and then to embarrassment, as he realized the scope of his error. The records Elvis showed him documented a level of expertise and dedication that put many formally trained medical professionals to shame. Pete's perfect safety record, his extensive self-taught medical knowledge, and his 30 years of flawless service were impressive by any standard. "I had no idea," Dr. Morrison admitted finally. "I made assumptions based on his job title, without understanding what he actually does." "That's exactly the problem," Elvis replied. "Pete represents thousands of workers whose contributions are essential but invisible. They keep the medical system running, but they never get credit for their expertise or dedication." Elvis's advocacy for Pete had immediate effects. The Memphis Commercial Appeal ran a front-page story about the ambulance driver, who had saved thousands of lives without recognition. The article included photographs of Pete at work, quotes from families he had helped, and testimonials from medical professionals who had worked with him over the years. The Tennessee Hospital Association not only created the award Elvis had suggested, but they made Pete the first recipient of the Unsung Hero in Healthcare recognition. The ceremony, held at the Peabody Hotel in downtown Memphis, was attended by medical professionals from across the state, civic leaders, and hundreds of people whose lives Pete had touched during his career. But the most meaningful recognition came from Pete's colleagues at Memphis General Hospital. The emergency room staff, nurses, and even some of the doctors who had worked with Pete over the years organized their own tribute. They presented him with a plaque that read, "To Pete O'Sullivan, who has been saving lives and caring for families for 30 years. We see you, we appreciate you, and we are honored to work alongside you." Dr. Morrison, who had learned from his mistake, made a point of publicly apologizing to Pete and acknowledging his contributions during the ceremony. He also announced that the hospital was creating a new position, emergency transport specialist, that would recognize the medical expertise that experienced ambulance drivers, like Pete, brought to patient care. The changes Elvis had helped initiate extended far beyond Memphis. Other hospitals began recognizing the contributions of their ambulance drivers, orderlies, technicians, and support staff who had been invisible despite their essential roles in patient care. Medical schools started including courses about the importance of non-physician team members in providing comprehensive health care. Pete's story became a catalyst for a broader conversation about how society recognizes and values different types of work. His 30 years of service, documented in his careful notebooks, demonstrated that expertise and dedication could exist outside traditional professional hierarchies, and that true heroism often went unnoticed because it didn't fit conventional definitions of importance. For Pete himself, the recognition was gratifying but also overwhelming. He had spent 3 decades working in anonymity, finding satisfaction in the knowledge that he was helping people during their most vulnerable moments. The sudden attention felt strange and sometimes uncomfortable, but he appreciated knowing that his work mattered to people beyond the patients and families he served directly. Elvis continued to visit Mrs. Williams during her recovery, but he also made time to ride along with Pete on several emergency calls. These experiences gave him even greater appreciation for the skills required to navigate Memphis traffic at high speeds while providing medical care to critically ill patients. He watched Pete comfort frightened children, reassure anxious family members, and make split-second decisions that could save lives. The ride-alongs also gave Elvis insight into the emotional toll of Pete's work. Every call was someone's worst day: IDS heart attacks, accidents, overdoses, domestic violence, sudden illnesses that turned normal families into medical emergencies. Pete dealt with human tragedy and suffering on a daily basis, yet he managed to maintain his compassion and dedication without becoming cynical or detached. "How do you do it?" Elvis asked Pete during a quiet moment between calls. "How do you see so much pain and still care so deeply about every patient?" Pete was quiet for a moment, watching the Memphis traffic through the ambulance windshield. "I think about the difference it makes," he said finally. "Every person I help get to the hospital has family, friends, people who love them. When I do my job well, I'm not just saving one life, I'm preventing a whole family from losing someone they can't live without. That perspective, seeing each patient not as a case, but as someone's beloved family member, had sustained Pete through 30 years of emergency calls. It had motivated him to learn medical procedures beyond his job requirements, to develop driving skills that bordered on the supernatural, and to provide emotional support to families during their darkest hours. The recognition Pete received changed his daily experience at work. Nurses who had always respected him now felt free to express that appreciation openly. Doctors began consulting him about patient conditions and transport decisions. Hospital administrators included him in discussions about improving emergency services and patient care protocols. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Pete saw himself. For 3 decades he had absorbed society's message that his work was unimportant, that anyone could do what he did, that real medical professionals were the people with degrees and hospital positions. Elvis's advocacy had helped him realize that his expertise, dedication, and compassion were exactly what made him a real medical professional, Pete, just one whose contributions had been systematically undervalued. The notebooks Pete had kept for 30 years became part of a larger archive documenting the history of emergency medical services in Memphis. Medical historians found his detailed records invaluable for understanding how pre-hospital care had evolved over the decades and how skilled practitioners had developed innovative approaches to saving lives in the field. Mrs. Williams made a full recovery from her heart surgery and lived for several more years, often telling people about how Elvis Presley had changed an ambulance driver's life by simply paying attention to his work and recognizing its value. She understood better than most that Elvis's intervention on Pete's behalf represented something larger than helping one person once. It was about creating a more just society that valued all forms of skilled, dedicated work. The story of Pete O'Sullivan became part of Memphis folklore, told and retold as an example of how recognition could transform not just individual lives but entire systems of value and respect. It demonstrated that heroism existed in unexpected places, that expertise developed outside formal institutions was still expertise, and that the most important work often happened without fanfare or recognition. 20 years later, when Pete finally retired from ambulance service, he had trained a new generation of emergency medical technicians who understood that their work required not just driving skills, but medical knowledge, emotional intelligence, and unwavering dedication to serving others. The profession he had helped elevate through his example had evolved to recognize and compensate the expertise it required. Elvis's advocacy for Pete had ripple effects that extended far beyond one man's career. It contributed to broader social changes in how American society valued different types of work, how medical institutions recognized non-physician contributors to patient care, and how communities honored the essential workers whose skills and dedication kept complex systems functioning. The metal cabinet in Pete's ambulance, which had once held only his personal notebooks documenting 30 years of unrecognized service, eventually contained awards, commendations, and letters of appreciation from thousands of people whose lives he had touched. But Pete often said that the most valuable recognition had come from Elvis Presley's simple acknowledgement that his work mattered and his determination to make sure the world knew it too. A scholarship fund at the University of Tennessee Medical School provides financial assistance to students interested in emergency medical services, established in Pete O'Sullivan's honor and funded by donations from people who believe that expertise and dedication deserve recognition regardless of job titles or professional hierarchies. The scholarship recipients learn not just medical procedures and protocols, but also the values that made Pete exceptional: honor, compassion for patients, respect for families, and understanding that heroism often wears work clothes and drives an ambulance through city streets, racing against time to save lives that might otherwise be lost. In the end, Pete's story became a testament to the power of recognition to transform both individual lives and social values. It proved that when influential people choose to see and celebrate the contributions of essential workers, they create ripple effects that benefit entire communities and change how society understands the true meaning of professional excellence and heroic service. The transformation of Pete's professional life had profound personal dimensions as well. For 3 decades, he had carried the weight of being invisible in a profession that celebrated some heroes while ignoring others. The constant stress of life or death decisions, combined with society's dismissal of his expertise, had taken a toll on his relationships and his sense of self-worth. Pete's wife, Mary, had watched her husband come home exhausted night after night, emotionally drained from dealing with human tragedy, while receiving little recognition for his skills and dedication. She had seen him question whether his work mattered, whether anyone appreciated the sacrifices he made to serve his community. The recognition Elvis helped bring changed not just Pete's professional standing, but the entire family's understanding of his contribution to society. Their 3 children, who had grown up hearing their father described as just a driver by some people, suddenly saw him celebrated as a community hero. The eldest, Patricia, was studying nursing at the University of Tennessee, and found that her professors began using her father's career as an example of how medical care extended beyond hospital walls into every aspect of emergency response. The middle child, Michael, was serving in Vietnam as a medic, and wrote letters home describing how his father's example had influenced his approach to caring for wounded soldiers under combat conditions. The skills Pete had developed over 30 years, staying calm under pressure, making quick medical decisions, providing comfort during trauma, were exactly the qualities Michael needed to save lives in a war zone. The youngest, Sarah, was still in high school, but began considering a career in emergency medicine after seeing how her father's recognition had elevated the entire field of pre-hospital care. She eventually became one of Tennessee's first female paramedics, carrying forward the values of compassionate service that had defined her father's career. The institutional changes that followed Pete's recognition extended throughout the Memphis medical community. Hospital administrators, who had previously viewed ambulance services as simple transportation, began investing in advanced training for emergency medical technicians. They upgraded equipment, improved communication systems, and created career advancement opportunities for ambulance personnel who demonstrated exceptional skills and dedication. Dr. Morrison, who had learned from his embarrassing encounter with Elvis, became an advocate for recognizing the contributions of all healthcare workers. He established monthly recognition ceremonies at Memphis General, highlighting the achievements of nurses, technicians, orderlies, and support staff whose work was essential but often overlooked. These ceremonies became models for other hospitals throughout Tennessee and beyond. The concept of celebrating unsung heroes in healthcare spread to medical institutions across the country, creating a cultural shift that valued competence and dedication regardless of job titles or educational credentials. The academic community also took notice of Pete's story. Medical schools began incorporating case studies about the importance of pre-hospital care into their curricula. Students learned to appreciate the expertise required for emergency medical services and to collaborate effectively with ambulance personnel, rather than dismissing them as mere transportation providers. Research institutions started studying the role of ambulance drivers in patient outcomes, documenting how the quality of pre-hospital care affected survival rates and recovery times. These studies validated what emergency room staff had known intuitively, that skilled, experienced ambulance personnel like Pete made crucial contributions to saving lives. The Memphis Fire Department, which operated the city's ambulance service, used Pete's recognition as an opportunity to recruit higher-quality candidates for emergency medical positions. They raised hiring standards, improved training programs, and offered better compensation packages designed to attract people who saw emergency medical services as a calling rather than just a job. Pete became involved in designing these new training programs, sharing his 3 decades of experience with recruits who were eager to learn from someone who had become a local legend. His emphasis on treating each patient with dignity, learning continuously throughout one's career, and finding meaning in service to others became core principles of the Memphis emergency medical training curriculum. The ripple effects of Pete's story reached into other essential service sectors as well. Police officers, firefighters, social workers, and other public servants found that society was beginning to pay more attention to their contributions and to recognize the expertise required for their work. Pete's example had demonstrated that heroism existed in many forms and that essential workers deserved respect for their skills and dedication. Union organizations representing healthcare workers, emergency responders, and other essential service employees began using Pete's story as an example of why their members deserved better recognition and compensation. They argued that society benefited when skilled, dedicated workers were valued appropriately, and that the quality of essential services improved when workers felt appreciated and respected. The media attention surrounding Pete's recognition led to a series of investigative reports about other unsung heroes in the Memphis community. Journalists began looking for stories about essential workers whose contributions had been overlooked, creating a wave of recognition for people who had been serving their communities without fanfare. These stories revealed school custodians who had prevented disasters through their vigilance, cafeteria workers who had provided emotional support for struggling students, maintenance personnel who had kept essential systems running during emergencies, and countless other workers whose expertise and dedication had made crucial differences in people's lives. Elvis's role in Pete's recognition also influenced how other celebrities approached their public platforms. Musicians, actors, and other public figures began looking for ways to highlight the contributions of essential workers in their communities. The concept of using fame and influence to bring recognition to deserving but overlooked individuals became more common throughout the entertainment industry. This trend created opportunities for many other essential workers to receive the recognition they deserved. Teachers, social workers, community organizers, and public servants who had been working in anonymity found themselves celebrated by influential advocates who understood the power of using celebrity platforms for social good. The long-term impact of Pete's story on emergency medical services was particularly significant. The profession evolved from a job that required little training and offered few advancement opportunities to a respected healthcare specialty that demanded extensive education and provided meaningful career paths. Paramedic programs expanded throughout Tennessee and neighboring states, offering comprehensive training in advanced life support techniques, emergency medicine, and patient psychology. These programs attracted high-quality candidates who were drawn to the profession's new status and the meaningful work it provided. The equipment and technology available to emergency medical personnel also improved dramatically. Ambulances became mobile intensive care units equipped with advanced monitoring devices, communication systems, and life support equipment that allowed paramedics to provide hospital-quality care in the field. Pete witnessed these changes with satisfaction, knowing that his recognition had contributed to improvements that would benefit countless patients and families. The profession he had served for 30 years had evolved into something that attracted and retained talented, dedicated individuals who could make even greater contributions to emergency medical care. The personal relationships Pete had built with patients and families over 3 decades became part of a larger network of community connections that strengthened Memphis's social fabric. The families who had been touched by Pete's care often remained in contact with him, creating extended relationships that went far beyond the original medical emergencies that had brought them together. These relationships demonstrated the human dimension of essential work and showed how skilled, compassionate service could create lasting bonds between workers and the communities they served. Pete's example inspired other essential workers to see their roles not just as jobs, but as opportunities to build meaningful connections with the people they served. The documentation of Pete's career through his detailed notebooks became part of a larger effort to preserve the history of essential workers and their contributions to community well-being. Historical societies and academic institutions began collecting similar records from other long-serving public employees, creating archives that honored their service and preserved their experiences for future generations. These archives revealed patterns of dedication, innovation, and community service that had previously been invisible to researchers and policymakers. The stories they contained provided evidence of how essential workers had adapted to changing conditions, developed innovative solutions to community problems, and maintained high standards of service despite limited resources and recognition. The scholarship fund established in Pete's honor eventually grew to support dozens of students pursuing careers in emergency medical services, healthcare, and other essential service fields. Recipients learned not just technical skills, but also the values that had made Pete exceptional: in compassion for those in need, dedication to continuous learning, and commitment to serving others without expectation of reward. These scholarship recipients carried Pete's legacy forward into new generations of essential workers who understood that their work required not just technical competence, but also emotional intelligence, ethical commitment, and understanding of their role in creating stronger, more caring communities. The annual Pete O'Sullivan Award, established by the Tennessee Hospital Association, became one of the most prestigious recognitions available to healthcare support personnel throughout the region. Recipients were selected based not just on technical excellence, but on their demonstration of the values Pete had embodied: in compassion, dedication, continuous learning, and commitment to serving others. The award ceremonies became opportunities to celebrate the contributions of essential workers and to remind healthcare institutions of their obligation to recognize and support all members of their teams. The stories shared during these ceremonies documented countless examples of heroism, innovation, and dedication among healthcare workers whose contributions might otherwise have remained invisible. Elvis continued to support these recognition efforts throughout his life, using his influence and resources to ensure that essential workers received appropriate appreciation for their contributions. He understood that Pete's story represented something larger than one person's career. It was about creating a more just society that valued all forms of skilled, dedicated work. The changes Pete's recognition had helped catalyze in Memphis became models for other communities seeking to improve their treatment of essential workers. Cities throughout the South and beyond began implementing similar recognition programs, training improvements, and institutional reforms designed to better support and appreciate the contributions of public servants. These efforts created a network of communities that shared best practices for recognizing essential workers, improving working conditions, and creating career advancement opportunities for public employees. The collaboration between these communities accelerated the pace of positive change and helped ensure that improvements reached workers in smaller towns and rural areas, as well as major cities. Today, nearly 50 years after Elvis first noticed Pete O'Sullivan's quiet competence and decided to advocate for his recognition, the principles they established continue to influence how society values essential work. The concept that expertise and heroism can exist in any profession, that recognition has the power to transform both individual lives and institutional cultures, and that influential people have a responsibility to use their platforms for social good remain relevant and important. Pete's ambulance, retired when he left the service, is preserved at the Memphis Fire Museum as a reminder of the era when emergency medical services began evolving into the sophisticated healthcare specialty it has become today. Visitors can see the simple but effective equipment Pete used to save thousands of lives and read excerpts from his notebooks that document 3 decades of dedication to serving others. The museum exhibit includes video testimonials from families whose lives Pete touched, colleagues who worked with him, and medical professionals who learned from his example. These testimonials reveal the human dimension of essential work and show how one person's commitment to excellence and compassion can influence entire communities and institutions. The exhibit's concluding message, written by Pete himself shortly before his death in 1995, reads, "I never expected recognition for doing my job, but I learned that recognition has the power to change not just individual lives, but entire systems of value and respect." When people with influence choose to see and celebrate the contributions of essential workers, they create opportunities for others to serve with dignity and pride. That might be the most important legacy anyone can leave. This message continues to inspire new generations of essential workers, community leaders, and advocates who understand that creating a more just and caring society requires recognizing and supporting the contributions of all people who dedicate their lives to serving others. The philosophical implications of Pete's story extended beyond individual recognition to broader questions about how society determines value and worth. His experience demonstrated that essential contributions to community well-being often went unrecognized not because they lacked importance, but because they didn't fit conventional definitions of professional success or social status. Academic researchers studying Pete's case identified it as an example of what sociologists call invisible labor, work that is essential to society's functioning, but receives little acknowledgement because it happens outside public view or involves populations that lack social power. Pete's 3 decades of life-saving service had been invisible, not because it was unimportant, but because ambulance drivers occupied a position in the medical hierarchy that made their expertise easy to overlook. This insight led to broader research into other forms of invisible labor that keep communities functioning. Studies revealed similar patterns of under-recognition among school custodians, cafeteria workers, hospital orderlies, social service case workers, and countless other employees whose skills and dedication were essential but rarely celebrated. The research findings influenced policy discussions about how to create more equitable recognition systems that valued all forms of skilled work, rather than just those that happened to carry high social status. Policymakers began considering how compensation, professional development opportunities, and public recognition could be distributed more fairly across different types of essential work. Pete's personal philosophy about finding meaning in service rather than recognition became part of a larger conversation about work, purpose, and human dignity. His example showed that it was possible to maintain high standards and deep commitment even when external validation was minimal, but it also demonstrated the transformative power of appropriate recognition when it finally came. This balance between internal motivation and external validation became a subject of study for industrial psychologists and organizational behavior researchers. They found that workers like Pete Meets, who maintained excellence despite lack of recognition, often performed better when they finally received appropriate acknowledgement, suggesting that recognition enhanced rather than replaced intrinsic motivation. The training programs that grew out of Pete's recognition began incorporating these psychological insights into their curricula. New emergency medical technicians learned not just technical skills, but also how to find personal meaning in their work, and how to maintain high standards regardless of external recognition while still advocating for appropriate professional respect. These training innovations influenced other fields as well. Professional development programs for teachers, social workers, and other service-oriented careers began emphasizing the importance of both internal purpose and external support, helping workers understand that seeking recognition was not selfish but necessary for maintaining the energy and motivation required for demanding service work. The media coverage of Pete's story also influenced how journalists approached stories about essential workers. Previously, such workers often appeared in news stories only during crises or labor disputes. Pete's example encouraged reporters to seek out positive stories about essential workers' contributions and to help the public understand the skill and dedication required for various types of service work. This shift in media coverage created more opportunities for essential workers to receive recognition and helped educate the public about the complexity and importance of jobs that had previously been taken for granted. The increased visibility helped build public support for better compensation and working conditions for essential service employees. The international impact of Pete's story surprised even Elvis, who had initially intended only to help one deserving individual receive appropriate recognition. Medical professionals from other countries learned about Pete's experience through professional journals and conferences, leading to similar recognition initiatives in healthcare systems worldwide. British ambulance services began implementing recognition programs modeled after those created in Memphis. Canadian healthcare administrators adopted similar approaches to celebrating the contributions of support staff. Australian medical schools incorporated case studies about Pete's experience into their curricula about healthcare team dynamics and professional respect. These international applications of Pete's story demonstrated that the issues it raised about recognition, professional hierarchy, and essential work were universal rather than specifically American problems. Healthcare systems everywhere struggled with how to appropriately value different types of contributions to patient care and community well-being. The global spread of Pete's influence created opportunities for international collaboration between organizations working to improve recognition for essential workers. Professional associations, labor unions, and advocacy groups began sharing strategies and supporting each other's efforts to create more equitable workplace cultures. Pete himself was initially uncomfortable with the international attention his story received. He remained modest about his contributions and worried that too much focus on his individual experience might distract from broader efforts to support all essential workers. However, he eventually embraced his role as a symbol of unrecognized dedication and used his platform to advocate for systemic changes that would benefit others. His speaking engagements at medical conferences, professional associations, and community organizations consistently emphasized that he was not unique in his dedication or skills. He used every opportunity to highlight other essential workers whose contributions deserved recognition and to argue for institutional changes that would make recognition more systematic rather than dependent on lucky encounters with influential advocates. This message resonated with audiences who recognized similar patterns of underappreciation in their own communities and workplaces. Pete's speeches often inspired audience members to return home and work for better recognition of essential workers in their own institutions and communities. The cumulative effect of these individual efforts was a gradual but significant cultural shift in how American society viewed essential work. Polls conducted in the decades following Pete's recognition showed increasing public support for better compensation, working conditions, and professional recognition for essential service workers. This cultural change influenced political discussions about minimum wage, healthcare benefits, professional development funding, and other policies affecting essential workers. Politicians who had previously ignored these issues found that supporting essential workers had become politically popular, leading to legislative improvements in many states and localities. The economic benefits of recognizing essential workers also became clear over time. Communities that invested in better recognition, training, and compensation for essential workers found that they attracted higher quality candidates for these positions and experienced better outcomes in terms of public health, safety, and community well-being. This created a positive cycle where improved recognition led to better performance, which led to greater public appreciation, which led to further improvements in recognition and support. Pete's story had helped initiate this cycle in Memphis, and similar patterns emerged in other communities that followed Memphis's example. The business community also began recognizing the value of supporting essential workers. Companies that provided services to hospitals, emergency services, and other public institutions found that investing in the professional development and recognition of their employees led to better customer relationships and improved business outcomes. This business interest in essential worker recognition created additional resources and opportunities for professional development, career advancement, and public acknowledgement. Private sector involvement helped sustain and expand recognition initiatives that might otherwise have been limited by public sector budget constraints. The Pete O'Sullivan story became a case study taught in business schools as an example of how recognition programs could create value for organizations, employees, and communities simultaneously. Students learned that investing in employee recognition was not just a moral imperative, but also a practical strategy for improving organizational effectiveness and public relationships. These business school graduates carried Pete's lessons into their own careers, implementing recognition programs and advocacy initiatives in their workplaces and communities. The influence of Pete's story thus continued to spread through new generations of business and community leaders who understood the importance of valuing all forms of skilled, dedicated work. Today, the principles Pete embodied in dedication to service, continuous learning, compassion for those in need, and commitment to excellence, regardless of recognition, continue to influence how professional development programs, workplace cultures, and community institutions approach the challenge of creating environments where all valuable work is appropriately recognized and supported. The enduring relevance of Pete's story lies not in its specific details about ambulance driving or 1970s Memphis, but in its demonstration that every community contains essential workers whose contributions deserve recognition, that influential people have the power and responsibility to advocate for appropriate recognition, and that systematic changes in how society values different types of work can create benefits that extend far beyond individual recognition to encompass entire communities and institutions.